On the 7th of December 2024, a satellite pass from NASA's Landsat 9 captured an image that sent shockwaves through the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. Water managers had expected to see a gradual transition, a sign of aquatic recovery. Instead, they saw a nightmare. As the massive spillways of Lake Okeechobee were cranked open, the water emerging wasn't the tea-colored tannin mix typical of Florida's wetlands. It was pitch black. More than 2 billion gallons of this opaque, contaminated fluid began surging every single day toward both the Atlantic and the Gulf coasts. The headlines at the time focused on the discharge volumes and algae risks. But those headlines missed the terrifying truth lurking beneath the surface. The water didn't turn black because of a sudden bloom. It turned black because the lake bed itself was hemorrhaging. After 7 decades of serving as a silent repository for industrial and agricultural waste, the bottom of Lake Okeechobee finally reached a breaking point. What the satellites revealed was the physical manifestation of an environmental debt coming due. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what Lake Okeechobee represents. It is Florida's liquid heart, 730 square miles of freshwater, making it the second largest lake located entirely within the United States. It sits in the center of the state like a massive, shallow bowl. 8 million people rely on this system for their drinking water. A staggering $40 billion agricultural industry depends on its levels for irrigation. It is the linchpin of the entire South Florida ecosystem, connected by a web of man-made canals to the St. Lucie River in the east, the Caloosahatchee River in the west, and the vast sawgrass plains of the Everglades to the south. But this heart is encased in a ribcage of steel and earth, the Herbert Hoover Dike, a 143-mile earthen levee constructed between the 1930s and 60s, following the horrific hurricane of 1928. While the dike protects the surrounding communities from flooding, it also turned the lake into a closed system, a giant bathtub with only a few controlled drains. And for 70 years, we have been filling that bathtub with things that were never meant to be there. Before the 1970s, Lake Okeechobee was a different world. It was a clear water system with over 50,000 acres of submerged aquatic vegetation. These plants acted as the lake's lungs and kidneys, filtering nutrients and providing a habitat for a world-class fishery. Then came the agricultural explosion. Massive dairy operations and sugarcane empires spread across the northern watershed. Every time it rained, fertilizer runoff rich in phosphorus and nitrogen was flushed into the lake. Nutrient loading increased by over 500%. As the phosphorus levels climbed, the native plants began to die, replaced by massive, toxic blue-green algae blooms. When the algae died, it sank. When the plants died, they sank. When the fertilizer sediment arrived, it stayed. Over 70 years, this created a layer of what scientists now call legacy mud. It is an unconsolidated, organic sediment layer that ranges from a few inches to nearly 3 feet thick at the center of the lake. Its texture is thixotropic. It acts like a solid when still, but the moment it is disturbed by a current, it turns into a thick, toxic liquid. It is a reservoir of 70 years of environmental mistakes, just waiting for the water to move. In late 2024, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers faced a dilemma. Between 2020 and 2024, Florida saw record-breaking rainfall. Lake levels stayed dangerously high, above 15 feet for years. This high water acted like a dark blanket, preventing sunlight from reaching the bottom, which killed off the remaining aquatic plants. In November 2024, Colonel Brandon Bowman announced a recovery plan. The goal was simple: lower the lake by 4 feet before the 2025 hurricane season. Lowering the water would allow sunlight to hit the lake bed, theoretically triggering the seeds of the aquatic plants to regerminate. On December 7, the gates opened. Structure 77 at Moore Haven sent water west. Structure 308 at Port Mayaca sent water east. The combined flow was over 2 billion gallons per day. The engineers expected a controlled drawdown. What they triggered was a hydraulic upheaval. As the water level dropped, the volume of the lake decreased by 44%. This created massive horizontal currents across the shallow bottom. These currents interacted with the thixotropic legacy mud, entraining it into the water column. The lake wasn't just X-raying its water, it was exporting its very floor. Within days, the turquoise waters near Sanibel Island and the Atlantic estuaries turned into a dark, suffocating soup. As the black water surged toward the coast in early 2025, a wave of public outcry forced the Army Corps and state scientists to scramble for a solution. 4 major theories were proposed to stop the hemorrhage, but each one collapsed under the weight of hydraulic reality. The first idea was simple. If high-speed water from the spillways is stirring up the mud, just slow down the gates. The proposal was to cut the discharge from 3,000 cubic feet per second to 1,500, extending the drawdown from 3 months to 6. The physics, however, said otherwise. The problem wasn't the speed at the gate, it was the depth of the lake. When you drop a 9-foot deep lake by 4 feet, you reduce the water column by nearly 45%. This creates massive internal circulation currents across the entire 730 square mile basin. Slowing the discharge didn't stop the mud from moving. It only ensured that the toxic export would last twice as long, prolonging the agony of the coastal estuaries. If the mud is the problem, take it out. This sounds logical until you look at the scale. Engineering assessments estimated that 200 square miles of the lake bed would require dredging roughly 100 million cubic yards of toxic material. The cost? Between $500 million and $2 billion. The timeline? A decade. But the ultimate deal breaker was the disposal crisis. There is nowhere in Florida to put 100 million cubic yards of toxic, phosphorus-laden mud without contaminating another aquifer. Furthermore, the act of dredging itself would create massive sediment plumes, effectively killing the lake's remaining ecosystem to save it. The third theory was the most popular. Send the water south. Instead of poisoning the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, why not send that fresh water into the Everglades, where it is desperately needed? The infrastructure reality intervened. The current capacity to move water south is roughly 1,700 cubic feet per second. During the 2024 emergency, the lake needed to shed 6,000 cubic feet per second. The stormwater treatment areas, STAs, the man-made marshes designed to filter nutrients, would have been completely overwhelmed. Sending the black water south would have bypassed the filters, dumping 70 years of agricultural toxins directly into the pristine sawgrass of the Everglades, potentially destroying a World Heritage Site forever. This is the hard truth Florida is now being forced to face. Lake Okeechobee isn't really a lake anymore. It's a nutrient sink. For 70 years, the state's agricultural industry treated it like a free dumping ground for waste. And all that phosphorus? It didn't disappear. It settled at the bottom. Year after year, it built up, quietly turning into a massive environmental debt. Now, every time water managers are forced to lower the lake, whether it's to prevent the dike from failing or simply to keep the ecosystem functioning, they're essentially paying interest on that debt. Each release of water stirs up decades of pollution, mobilizing the mistakes of the 1950s, the 60s, and the 70s, and pushing them straight into the 21st century. And the consequences of the December 2024 discharge won't fade anytime soon. Scientists say the effects will ripple through Florida's coastal rivers for years. Between 2025 and 2030, many of these ecosystems could enter what researchers call chronic impairment. The damage shows up in several ways. First, oyster mortality. The sediment-heavy water settles over oyster beds, suffocating them. In some areas, populations are expected to drop by as much as 60%. Second, a food crisis for manatees. As the water grows cloudier, sunlight can't reach the seagrass meadows below. The grass dies off, and with it, the primary food source for Florida's iconic manatees. And finally, the economic fallout. Coastal communities like Sanibel and Fort Myers rely heavily on tourism and fishing, but with polluted water and collapsing ecosystems, losses could climb into the hundreds of millions of dollars every year. While the Army Corps of Engineers was checking off their success boxes in the Central Lake, the coastal estuaries of Florida were entering a state of emergency. The 180 billion gallons of black water released over 3 months didn't just stay in the river channels. It redefined the chemistry of the coast. Estuaries like the St. Lucie and the Caloosahatchee are delicate nurseries. They rely on a precise balance of salt and fresh water. When you dump 2 billion gallons of fresh water per day, the salinity drops to near zero. Oysters, which are the biological filters of our coasts, cannot survive in pure freshwater for extended periods. By January 2025, Oyster mortality rates in the St. Lucie reached 90%. When the oysters die, the entire reef structure collapses. This isn't just a loss for the environment, it's the destruction of a natural barrier that protects our shorelines from storm surges. Seagrass needs sunlight. The black water was so opaque that it acted like a lead curtain. In areas where seagrass meadows had thrived for decades, the lack of light meant photosynthesis stopped. Within weeks, the meadows began to rot. This created a secondary disaster, the manatee crisis. Florida's manatees depend on these grasses for survival. As the black water moved in, the food source moved out. We are now looking at a 2026 to 2030 forecast of chronic manatee starvation, a direct legacy cost of the December 2024 discharge. To truly understand why the water turned black, we have to look at the molecular level. Scientists from Florida Gulf Coast University, FGCU, took samples of the legacy mud during the 2024 discharge, and the results were more alarming than the visual blackness. Phosphorus is a sticky element. It binds to soil particles. For 70 years, the lake acted as a trap for this phosphorus. But there is a limit to how much a lake bed can hold. The mud has become saturated. When the lake level dropped, the change in pressure and the increase in current velocity caused a desorption event. The phosphorus didn't just move with the mud, it dissolved back into the water at toxic levels. The phosphorus concentrations recorded in early 2025 were 500% higher than the federal safety limits for the Everglades. This is fuel for the red tide, Karenia brevis, organisms waiting in the Gulf of Mexico. We aren't just sending mud downstream, we are sending a super fuel for toxic blooms that will plague Florida's beaches for years to come. It's not just nutrients. The legacy mud contains traces of banned pesticides from the 1960s and 70s, including DDT derivatives and copper-based algicides used to kill earlier blooms. These heavy metals and persistent organic pollutants, POPs, were locked in the mud until the 2024 drawdown. Now, they are in the food chain. Fish tissue samples taken in February 2025 showed mercury and copper levels that triggered immediate do not consume advisories for local fishermen. The Lake Okeechobee crisis has ignited a political and legal firestorm that is reshaping Florida's future. It is a war of geography versus economy. To the north and south of the lake lie the massive EAA, Everglades Agricultural Area lands. These industries rely on the lake for irrigation and as a flood control valve. To the east and west are the billion-dollar tourism economies of Stewart, Sanibel, and Fort Myers. For the first time in history, coastal cities are filing multi-billion-dollar lawsuits against the state and the Army Corps. They argue that the recovery operation of 2024 was a de facto subsidy for the agricultural industry, sacrificing the coastal property values and tourism revenue to maintain the status quo for Big Sugar and dairy. The legal question is simple. Who owns the right to clean water? The 2024 Black Water event proved that you cannot have a healthy agricultural economy and a healthy coastal economy using the same 1950s infrastructure. Something has to give. If dredging is too expensive and sending water south is too slow, what is the answer? The state is currently betting on the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, CERP, a $16 billion project aimed at getting the water right. This involves building massive reservoirs, like the EAA reservoir, to hold lake water and filter it before it goes south. But here is the catch. Even the EAA reservoir, scheduled for completion in the early 2030s, can only hold a fraction of the 180 billion gallons released in late 2024. The scale of the legacy mud problem is simply larger than our current engineering capacity. We are trying to solve a 21st century ecological crisis with 20th century plumbing. The something moving below Lake Okeechobee wasn't a mystery. We want to hear from you. Do you believe the state of Florida should prioritize flood control for agriculture, or should they protect the coastal estuaries at any cost? Is there a middle ground, or are we stuck in a zero-sum game? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigative deep dive into Florida's ecological time bomb eye-opening, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe The Ultimate Reveal. Thanks for watching, and remember, the most dangerous things are often the ones we've spent decades trying to bury.